They told me the names were a clerical error. That was the first lie. In the autumn of 1866, when the dust of war still hung over Georgia like smoke that refused to lift, I purchased what remained of Maple Ridge Plantation. The fields were exhausted, the main house hollowed by neglect, and the books, what little had survived Sherman's march, were stacked in a warped cabinet in the front study. It should have been simple: tally debts, survey acreage, rebuild. Instead, on the third day of renovations, a laborer pried loose a rotted panel near the upstairs chimney. The wall opened like a mouth. Dozens of folded sheets spilled out onto the floor. They were not letters. They were lists. Neatly written columns of names. Nearly half of them did not exist in the county registry. According to official records, those people had never been born, sold, baptized, married, or buried. So who had been keeping account of lives the system insisted were never there? Before we go further, if you find yourself drawn to stories buried beneath official history, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. And tell me in the comments where you are reading from. The silence around places like Maple Ridge was never local. It was national. I did not come to Georgia to unearth ghosts. I came to rebuild something practical out of ruin. I was a Northerner, Boston-born, trained in mercantile bookkeeping, not in the slow rot of plantation power. Maple Ridge was cheap because its former owner, William Carter, had died in debt in early 1866, leaving behind unpaid taxes and a reputation that neighbors described as unfortunate. That word would return to me often. The house itself stood 2 miles from the nearest road, white paint blistered, shutters hanging crooked. Inside, the air smelled of soot and damp plaster. Formerly enslaved families had already left for town or for land promised elsewhere. The place felt abandoned not only by people, but by memory. The lists changed that. Each sheet bore a date between 1848 and 1864. Names were written in careful script, first names, sometimes a surname, sometimes only a single word. Beside many names were small symbols, a dash, a circle, a cross. At first, I assumed they were inventory notations. But inventory of what? I took 3 of the pages into town and presented them to the county registrar, a thin man named Albright, who had resumed his office under federal supervision. He adjusted his spectacles and ran his finger down the first column. "These names," he said, "are not recorded here." "Could the courthouse records have been destroyed?" I asked. "Some were," he admitted, "but not selectively." He looked at me in a way that was less ignorance than caution. "If these people existed," he said carefully, "they would have passed through some record. A sale, a birth, a tax entry. There is nothing." Nothing. That was the second lie. Because the handwriting was deliberate, the ink consistent. Whoever wrote these lists believed the names mattered enough to preserve inside a wall, which meant someone knew the official books were incomplete. That night, I spread the pages across the dining table in the abandoned house. By lantern light, patterns emerged. Dates clustered around harvest seasons. Several names appeared in sequence, then vanished. One page contained 12 names in a row, each marked with a small cross. At the bottom, in a hand slightly heavier than the rest, a sentence. "They are not gone. They are only moved." Moved where? I began to understand something uncomfortable. Before the war, power here had not rested solely on ownership. It had rested on paperwork. A person existed if ink declared them so. Without ink, they were vapor. If these lists were accurate, Maple Ridge had been conducting transactions beyond the registry. Private sales, undocumented transfers, perhaps even children removed before names could enter any official ledger. The anomaly was mathematical. In 1856, tax records show Carter reported 72 enslaved persons. In 1857, he reported 61. No epidemic was recorded. No mass sale documented. 11 lives evaporated on paper. Yet on the hidden list for that year, 11 names appear, each marked with a cross. Sold without record, dead without burial, erased deliberately. I returned to the registrar with more pages. This time he did not examine them as closely. "You should be careful," Albright said quietly. "Reconstruction is fragile. There are men in this county who held office before the war and held influence still. Digging into old irregularities benefits no one." "Except those who were erased," I replied. He did not answer. Over the following week, we opened more walls. Behind the kitchen stove, we found a narrow compartment stuffed with folded paper bound by twine. The handwriting shifted between entries, at least 3 different hands across the years. Someone had been keeping parallel accounts. Official books for the county, hidden books for the truth. One afternoon, while clearing the basement, a worker discovered a partition sealed with boards too new to match the rest of the structure. We pried it loose. Behind it lay a narrow chamber no larger than a closet. The air was stale. The wall opposite the entrance was covered in tally marks, hundreds of them, scratched into plaster. Counting days. Counting what? On the floor, beneath a loose brick, we found a single scrap of paper. The ink was faded but legible. They think we are not keeping count. Not we. We. The handwriting did not match Carter's signature in the deed of sale, nor did it match the earlier entries. This was someone else. Someone inside the system, but not entirely of it. As the days passed, unease replaced curiosity. I had purchased land, but inherited a record of concealed lives. The names on those pages felt heavier than deeds or debts. I began copying everything by hand at night, in case the originals were taken. Because by then, I was certain of one thing. Someone else knew these records existed, and history had already decided they should not. 2 mornings after the tally chamber, I rode into town again, not to ask questions, but to listen. In the courthouse square, men gathered as they always had, leaning on railings, trading news the way they traded seed and mules. Their talk was of crops, of federal agents, of outside agitators, and of what they called order, as though order had ever meant anything but the comfort of those who wrote it down. When I mentioned Maple Ridge, the responses came too quickly. "Bad land," one said. "Carter had troubles," another offered. A third, older than the rest, spat into the dirt and told me, "Best you fix the roof and keep your head down." No one asked why a northerner had bought that particular ruin. No one expressed surprise that I'd found papers in the walls. Their indifference felt rehearsed. In Boston, silence was an absence. Here, it was a discipline. That afternoon, I went through what remained of Carter's office. The desk had been looted long before I arrived, but a false bottom in the bottom drawer yielded a thin packet of receipts, mundane, almost comforting. Nails, lamp oil, flour. Yet several invoices carried no merchant name, only initials and a place. SM and Macon. The amounts were large and the descriptions vague. Transfer, handling, care. In the corner of one invoice, a symbol, a small circle. I returned to the hidden lists and found the same circle beside 3 names in 1859. A circle, not a cross, not a dash. I had assumed the markings were simple. They were a language. It would have been easy, tempting even, to believe the war had broken the old system, that emancipation had shattered the machinery of disappearance. But the county ledgers told another story. The same men who had signed property transfers before 1865 now signed tax notices and held minor offices under new oaths. Their hands had changed paper, not practice. I began visiting churches, because churches keep records even when courthouses burn. The white minister at the Baptist meeting house met me at the door and spoke with polished courtesy. But his eyes drifted over my shoulder, scanning the road as if expecting witnesses. He brought out his baptism book and opened it with reverence. "You're looking for colored names?" he asked. "I'm looking for names," I said. "People attached to Maple Ridge." He ran a finger down the page, then closed the book with an almost gentle finality. "Many were never baptized," he said. "Many never attended." His tone suggested that absence was natural, as if faith itself followed the same rules as law. A black preacher in the freedmen settlement was less cautious, but no less careful. His meeting house was a rough plank building with benches that still smelled of fresh-cut pine. He did not greet me as friend or enemy. He greeted me as risk. "You found papers," he said before I could speak. The certainty of it tightened my throat. "How do you know?" I asked. He did not answer directly. He gestured for me to sit. "You are learning what this county learned long ago," he said. "That a person can be carried off and made to vanish if the right ink never touches the right page." He told me the unwritten rules as if reciting scripture, rules that had survived the Confederacy's death. Some sales were never recorded. Some children were moved before anyone could mark their birth. Some buyers were too influential to question. Complaints meant punishment, and punishment taught the rest to keep quiet. "Who benefits?" I asked. He looked at me until I understood the question was naive. "Everyone who mattered," he said. "The sheriff who looked away. The clerk who lost a page. The minister who preached obedience. The neighbor who bought cheap labor and asked no questions." I asked him about the symbols: dash, circle, cross. His gaze dropped for the first time, as though the marks themselves could summon attention. "I have seen those before," he admitted. "Not at Maple Ridge. Elsewhere." "Do you know what they mean?" "I know what people say they mean," he replied. "A dash for one kind of living, a circle for one kind of ending, a cross for the kind of sale where a mother finds out too late." He spoke the last words in a flat tone, not dramatic, worse, familiar. That night, back at the plantation, I reread the lists with new eyes. The paper did not feel old. It felt active, like a current. I realized the true power of the system had never been chains alone. It had been the authority to declare what was real. On the 4th page from the bottom of the bundle, a name appeared twice: Emma Brooks. Once as a signature at the margin, once in the body of an entry, as though the writer needed to remind themselves that their hand existed. I searched the county registry for her and found nothing. No marriage, no deed, no burial. She, too, was absent from the official world, yet present in the hidden one. I had spent my life believing paper followed life, that records were shadows of reality. Maple Ridge suggested the opposite. Reality here followed paper. If the ledger denied you, you could be made to vanish. And if that was true, then whoever had built this private account had been doing something dangerous. Not merely remembering, but defying the authority that decided who counted. Near midnight, as I stacked the pages back into their cloth wrap, I heard hooves on the drive. Slow, unhurried, as if the rider knew I would not run. I blew out the lamp and watched from the dark window. A single figure sat on a horse beneath the bare oaks, not calling out, not approaching the door, only waiting, patient as an owner. Then he lifted his hand and tapped the brim of his hat, a gesture that felt less like greeting than acknowledgement, as though my discovery had been expected. He did not dismount. In the thin wash of moonlight, I could make out only the outline of him. Broad hat, straight back, reins held loosely as if the animal and rider shared the same patience. He did not call my name. He did not need to. In a county where strangers were noted before their boots touched the road, my arrival had been recorded long before I found the papers. After several minutes, he turned the horse with a slow pressure of his heel and rode back toward the trees. No threat spoken, no demand made. The message was simpler than words. You are seen. The next morning I asked in town who rode a dark gelding with a white blaze and wore his hat low even at dusk. No one answered directly. One man shrugged. Another suggested I invest in better locks for the house. It was advice offered in a tone of courtesy, not concern. By then I understood that the hidden ledger had not been hidden from everyone. It had been hidden from history. I returned to the lists and began reconstructing patterns across years. The handwriting shifted, yes, but certain habits remained. The loop of an R, the long tail of a Y. 3 writers at least, possibly more. Emma Brooks appeared again in 1852, this time not as a name in the column, but as a notation in the margin. E.B. verified. Verified what? If she had been a house manager or literate domestic, as the Freedman's preacher suspected, she would have moved between rooms, between overheard conversations and closed doors. She would have known which wagons left after dark and which children vanished before dawn. I began comparing the hidden names against advertisements from regional newspapers, sales announced in Savannah, Macon, Augusta. When a man boasted of acquiring sound young stock 10 to 12 years of age, no names were printed, only numbers. The hidden lists, however, gave those numbers shape. One cluster from 1859 showed 5 names marked with crosses within the same week. A week later, an advertisement in the Macon Telegraph offered 5 field hands, prime and disciplined, from an unnamed coastal estate. Maple Ridge sat inland. The transfer had left no county record. It had left a cross. The more I worked, the more the ledger felt less like a record of sales and more like a counter-ledger, an act of accounting against power. The official books declared loss in acreage and yield. The hidden one declared loss in children. On the 12th page, beneath a list dated March 1861, a second sentence appeared, written in a firmer hand. They will say we consented. I read it 3 times. Consent was the language of contracts. Consent was what legitimized every transaction before the war. To assert that they would claim consent was to understand the defense before it was spoken. Late that afternoon, I rode to the edge of the former slave quarters, now mostly empty cabins. In one, I found a woman sorting through what remained of her belongings. She had not left with the others. Her age was difficult to measure. War compresses faces into something older than years. I introduced myself. She did not give her name at first. "Did you know Emma Brooks?" I asked. Her hands stilled over a folded blanket. "Everyone knew Miss Emma," she said finally. "Was she the house manager?" "She kept the keys," the woman replied. "And she kept count." The phrase tightened the air between us. Count of what? Of who was taken, of who was promised to come back, of who never did. I told her about the chamber behind the basement wall, about the tally marks carved into plaster. She closed her eyes. She counted days there, she said, after they took her brother. Taken where? The woman's gaze sharpened, and for a moment I felt the distance between my curiosity and her cost. "Private sale," she said. "No paper, no witness." "Did Emma survive the war?" I asked. "She survived long enough to see the soldiers come," she answered. "Long enough to believe paper might change." "And then?" "She left." "Where?" The woman shook her head. "North, maybe. Or to Savannah. Or nowhere you could find her. No burial record. No marriage license. No registry entry. Erased from one system, present in another." As I rode back to the house, I felt the full shape of the structure I had stepped into. Before the war, William Carter had owned Maple Ridge. But ownership here had been layered. There had been a visible order, the deeds, the tax filings, the polite dinners with neighboring planters. And beneath it, a private economy. Unregistered transfers, children moved without notice, names omitted by design. If the hidden ledger proved true, some of the buyers listed in the margins now held public office under federal oversight. Men who signed loyalty oaths in 1865 had signed silent receipts in 1859. Power had not died. It had revised itself. That night, I began drafting copies of the most damning pages, intending to send them to a lawyer I trusted in Chicago and to a school for freed children that had written seeking funds. If these names were proof of illegal private sales, particularly of children sold without registration, then the families might have claim to something. At the very least, the truth would exist outside this county's reach. I sealed the first envelope near midnight. The second, I did not finish. A knock sounded at the front door, measured, deliberate. When I opened it, the rider from the previous night stood on the porch, hat in hand this time. "My name is John Hayes," he said evenly. "I hear you've been sorting through some old family papers." His smile did not reach his eyes. "I represent interested parties," he continued, "and I would like to purchase anything you found that might be misunderstood." Purchase. Even now, the system believed everything could be bought. Behind him, the road lay empty. The fields beyond were dark. I understood then that the hidden ledger had never been entirely forgotten. It had only been waiting to see who would open the wall. Hayes declined to step inside. He remained on the porch, hat held politely against his chest, boots placed just so, as though crossing the threshold without invitation would signal aggression he preferred to disguise. "I don't misunderstand papers," I said. "No," he replied evenly, "but others might, especially in times like these." Reconstruction had given the county a thin layer of federal oversight. But men like Hayes spoke with the confidence of those who understood where true authority still rested. "What parties do you represent?" I asked. "Families concerned about reputations," he answered. offices newly held, positions hard won after a difficult war. The kind of stability this county needs. Stability. Another word for silence. He produced an envelope from his coat, thick, already sealed. "You've invested in Maple Ridge," he continued. "Repairs cost money. Labor costs money. Consider this a gesture of goodwill. In exchange, you surrender any private memoranda found within the structure. They were never intended for public confusion." Confusion. The hidden ledger had been written with deliberate clarity. "And if I decline?" I asked. Hayes smiled faintly. "Then I would worry about accidents. Fire travels easily in old houses. So does rumor." He replaced his hat and stepped back. "Think carefully, Mr. Reed. History is fragile." When he rode away, the weight of the house changed. The beams seemed less like timber and more like tinder. I did not open his envelope. I placed it unopened atop the ledger pages on the dining table and stared at both as though they were competing currencies. Destroy the records. Sell them. Publish them. Each path led to consequence. By morning, I chose a fourth option. I began packing the originals into a wooden crate lined with oilcloth. Not to destroy, not yet to publish, but to remove. The first copy I had drafted would still go north, quietly, without return address. Before sealing the crate, I reviewed the final pages again. One entry from late 1863 stood apart. The handwriting, Emma's, I believed, was hurried, ink-blotched as if written in haste. 3 remain unaccounted, moved before dawn, sheriff present. A sheriff's presence implied legality, or the appearance of it. I rode to the courthouse with that page folded in my pocket. The current sheriff was a different man than the one listed in 1863, but the office kept archives. After some persuasion, and the subtle reminder that federal auditors still pass through counties like ours, I was permitted to examine the old docket books. There it was. A notation from December 1863. Transfer of property, private, witnessed, no registry required. No registry required. No names listed. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man who now sat on the county council, tasked with overseeing public welfare under the new order. The system had not broken during the war. It had shielded itself. When I returned to Maple Ridge that evening, smoke lingered in the air, not from fire, but from brush burned in a distant field. The scent was enough to remind me how easily timber surrendered. Inside, the house felt exposed. Every wall I had opened now seemed an accusation. I nailed the partition in the basement back into place, not to hide the chamber again, but to protect the tally marks from casual destruction. They were evidence not of a single crime, but of duration, of days counted in confinement. As I hammered, I found myself counting 2. 1 for each name erased from registry. 2 for each buyer who prospered. 3 for each official who signed without ink of record. Power had been meticulous here. It had not relied on chaos. It had relied on procedure, carefully constructed loopholes that allowed human beings to move like contraband without ever touching official paper. Upstairs, I finished sealing the crate. At dawn, I would send it north on a supply wagon bound for Atlanta, then onward by rail. I kept only copies in the house. If Hayes meant what he implied, the originals would not survive a second visit. That night, sleep refused me. I sat by the cold hearth, the unopened envelope still resting on the table. Near midnight, a sound came, not of hooves this time, but of something brushed along the outer wall. Slow. Testing. I stepped outside with a lantern. No one stood in the yard, but carved lightly into the doorframe, fresh, shallow, was a symbol. A circle. Not a cross, not a dash. A circle. Alive. Sold. A message. Someone was reminding me that I, too, existed within a ledger not of my making. The system was patient. It had survived war, occupation, emancipation. It would survive a northerner with a crate of names, unless I chose my next act carefully. Inside the house, I extinguished the lantern and sat in darkness. If I published immediately, families might face retaliation. If I destroyed the evidence, history would seal shut. If I stayed silent, I became part of the machinery. In the quiet, I understood Emma Brooks's choice more clearly. She had not written to accuse, she had written to count. And counting, in a place built on erasure, was an act of resistance. By dawn, the crate was loaded. Whether it would reach Chicago untouched, I could not know. But the ledger would no longer be contained by Maple Ridge's walls. And somewhere beyond this county's reach, ink would begin to move again. The wagon left before sunrise. I stood in the yard as the driver, a freedman bound for Atlanta with tools and salt pork, tucked the crate beneath sacks of meal and canvas. I told him only that the contents were ledgers meant for a lawyer in Chicago. I did not mention names. He did not ask. As the wheels cut ruts through the damp soil, I felt the first true fracture in the county's control. The originals were no longer inside these walls. But I was. By noon, word had traveled faster than any wagon. In town, conversation ceased when I entered the general store. The registrar, Albright, avoided my eye entirely. A councilman, once a planter, paused beside me at the counter and spoke with false warmth. "Settling in, Mr. Reed?" "As well as can be expected." "Maple Ridge has a history," he said lightly. "Some histories are best left where they rest." "I prefer accurate ones," I replied. His smile held for a beat too long. "Accuracy is a matter of consensus," he said. That sentence revealed more than any threat. Accuracy here was not discovered. It was negotiated. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Chicago, far too quickly for comfort. My contact, Attorney Charles Wentworth, had received the first copies and responded with alarm. "If authentic," he wrote, "these documents suggest systematic evasion of registry law and possible illegal interstate trafficking. However, publication without sworn testimony may expose surviving families to retaliation. We must proceed carefully." Proceed carefully. The phrase echoed Hayes's caution in reverse. That same afternoon, a different visitor arrived at Maple Ridge, this time without concealment. He rode up openly in a carriage bearing the county seal. Councilman Avery. He did not pretend courtesy. "You've stirred unnecessary curiosity," he said once inside. "We've been patient with federal interference. We've rebuilt what was damaged. And now you arrive with accusations rooted in papers no one authorized." "They were authorized by ink," I said evenly. "Just not yours." Avery's jaw tightened. "You mistake private arrangements for crimes. Before the war, property transfers were flexible." "Children are not flexible," I answered. He stepped closer. "Careful. You speak as though Reconstruction will last forever. It will not. Federal soldiers will leave. Courts will return to local control. And when they do, men who disrupt the peace may find themselves without allies. Peace, another word bent into service of silence. I have sent copies north, I told him. The effect was immediate. His composure cracked, not fully, but enough. You should hope those copies never surface publicly, he said quietly. Because if they do, families here will suffer for your righteousness. The threat was not directed at me. It was directed at the very people whose names filled the hidden ledger. After he left, I understood the trap clearly. Expose the truth, and surviving families, now free but economically dependent, would bear retaliation from employers, landlords, and officials who still controlled land and credit. Remain silent, and the system would close ranks again. Emma Brooks had faced the same geometry. She had counted, but she had not published. In the days that followed, I sought out the freedmen's settlement again. The preacher listened as I described Avery's visit. They will not attack you directly, he said. Not yet. They will make work scarce, credit scarce, safety scarce. And they will say it has nothing to do with papers. What would you have me do? I asked. He studied the dirt floor before answering. Find the families first, the ones named. Let them decide what risk they are willing to take. It was the only moral path left. For the next week, I began tracing names not through official books, but through word of mouth. In Macon, a woman recognized her sister's name from one of the copied lists. In Savannah, a dock worker remembered a boy sold private in 1859 who had vanished from the registry entirely. Each confirmation turned abstraction into injury. The symbols gained weight. Dash, alive, sold. Circle, dead. Cross, sold without family knowledge. The ledger had not merely recorded commerce. It had recorded betrayal. On the 7th night after the crate departed, smoke did come, not distant brush, but from Maple Ridge itself. I woke to the smell first. Then to heat. Flames crawled along the back wing where the kitchen had once stood. Dry timber caught quickly. I grabbed the copies and fled into the yard as fire consumed what remained of Carter's house. Neighbors arrived with buckets, but their urgency felt performative. No one questioned how a structure long unused had ignited without storm or lightning. By dawn, the house was skeletal. The hidden chamber in the basement was ash, the tally marks erased. Hayes rode up mid-morning, surveyed the ruin, and removed his hat. "Terrible accident," he said softly. "Yes," I answered. "Terrible." He looked at me for a long moment. "Let this be a lesson," he added. "It is," I replied, "but not the one you intend." Because the originals were already gone. The system had burned the evidence it could see. It did not yet know the ledger had crossed state lines. Standing in the smoke, I felt something shift irrevocably. Maple Ridge was no longer a property. It was a crime scene without walls. The power that governed this county believed destruction restored control. But destruction also creates witnesses. And somewhere north of here, ink was preparing to move beyond their reach. The question no longer was whether the truth existed. It was whether enough people would risk standing beside it. The fire did not end the matter. It exposed it. Within a week of Maple Ridge burning, 3 families approached me quietly. 2 from Macon, 1 from Savannah. Each carrying fragments of memory that aligned with the copied ledger pages now in my possession. A mother who remembered her son transferred before dawn in 1859. A sister who had searched registry books for a name that never appeared. A man who had been told his brother died, though no burial could be located. The symbols were no longer abstractions. They were wounds. Attorney Wentworth wrote again from Chicago, his tone sharpened by what he had begun verifying through interstate trade manifests. Several of the private transfers listed correspond to shipments recorded as agricultural labor stock, moving northward through intermediaries, he explained. The absence of registry entries suggests deliberate evasion. If this reaches federal court, it will implicate office holders currently serving under Reconstruction Authority. Implicate. The word trembled between justice and catastrophe. In 1871, federal enforcement in Georgia had already begun to recede. Troops were fewer, oversight looser. Local councils regained confidence daily. To accuse sitting officials of pre-war illegal trafficking, particularly involving children, would not merely embarrass them. It would threaten the fragile architecture of post-war governance. I understood then why Hayes had not demanded the papers outright. The system preferred negotiation to seizure. Open force invited inquiry. Silence restored equilibrium. Yet silence was no longer possible. Wentworth proposed a measured strategy. Affidavits from surviving relatives, corroboration from shipping records, and submission not to local courts, but to a federal inquiry already examining Reconstruction abuses in neighboring states. It would be slow. It would be dangerous. It would also ensure that retaliation could not be confined to one county. I returned to the freedmen's settlement and gathered those willing to sign statements. Not all agreed. Some feared loss of employment. Others feared violence. Fear was not cowardice here. It was arithmetic. But enough signed. 12 affidavits. 31 names. 3 former buyers identified. One of those buyers now held a seat in the state assembly. When notice of the inquiry was quietly filed, Hayes returned. This time he did not bother with courtesy. "You misunderstand your position," he said flatly. "Reconstruction is ending. Washington's appetite for Southern scandal is thin. Do you believe Northern juries will care about transactions 10 years old?" "I believe records care," I answered. He laughed, not kindly. "Records can be disputed, memories can be discredited, witnesses can recant." "And burned houses can be rebuilt?" I asked. His expression hardened. "You could have taken the money," he said. "You could have lived comfortably." Comfort had never been neutral in this county. "You mistake my motive," I replied. "I am not dismantling your system. I am exposing its accounting." He studied me as though recalculating risk. "You think power resides in paper," he said. "No," I answered. "Power resides in who controls it." He left without another word. Months passed before the first federal investigator arrived. A man named Harold Pierce, thin, precise, cautious. He did not announce himself publicly. He reviewed copies in my temporary office above a dry goods store, then traveled quietly to Savannah and Macon to compare shipping logs. His conclusion was clinical. The evidence suggests systemic evasion of registry law, particularly in cases involving minors. Whether prosecution will follow depends on political appetite. Political appetite. Justice required not only proof, but willingness. In the spring of 1871, before formal charges could be drafted, news reached us. Cypress Grove Plantation, owned by one of the former buyers named in the affidavits, burned to the ground in a nighttime blaze. Official cause: overturned kerosene lamp. 2 weeks later, another named official resigned abruptly due to health. The third denied all allegations publicly, calling them northern fabrications designed to destabilize local governance. No indictment came that year, or the next. Reconstruction weakened. Federal troops withdrew further. Attention shifted westward to railroads and expansion. The inquiry file did not vanish. It was archived. Archived is a polite word for delayed. Yet something irreversible had occurred. Families used the ledger copies to trace kin. Over time, more than 30 individuals were located across Georgia, Alabama, and as far north as Tennessee. Men and women who had been unregistered at sale, yet lived, married, bore children. Reunions were not cinematic. They were quiet, stunned, and often incomplete. 3 names remained unresolved, Emma Brooks among them. Years later, a package arrived at a small college archive in Savannah, forwarded through Wentworth's office. Inside lay a short letter in careful handwriting. 3 remain unaccounted for. This is not failure. It is obligation. It was signed simply, E.B. Emma had survived long enough to know counting was not enough. Counting required continuity. Maple Ridge never stood again. The land was parceled and sold. No marker indicates what lay behind its walls. The official version still reads, accidental fire, routine transfers, no evidence of wrongdoing. But in Chicago, in Savannah, and in private family Bibles, the copied ledger persists. Columns of names once declared non-existent. The system attempted to erase them twice, first with silence, then with flame. It succeeded only once. History moved on, as it always does, absorbing scandal into footnotes. Yet one question has never left me. If Maple Ridge concealed dozens of unregistered lives within a single house, how many other walls once held names of those the records swore had never existed? If you have followed this account to its end, consider sharing your thoughts, your theories, your doubts, your own family histories. Subscribe if you wish to continue exploring the spaces where power edits memory. And tell me where you are reading from. Because counting only works if someone continues. Years have passed since Maple Ridge burned, yet the smoke has never entirely left me. In the official county history, printed in 1882, the plantation is mentioned only once. Destroyed by accidental fire during the unsettled years of Reconstruction. William Carter is described as a man of his time. No reference is made to private transfers. No suggestion of irregularities. The tally chamber never existed. Accuracy, as Councilman Avery once said, became consensus. The federal inquiry eventually dissolved into paperwork. Reconstruction collapsed not with a bang, but with a series of compromises. Withdrawn troops, negotiated elections, restored local authority. The men implicated in the affidavits resumed influence under new party banners. Some even attended commemorations of reconciliation, where former Union and Confederate officers shook hands for photographers. Reconciliation requires forgetting, but forgetting requires permission. The ledger copies remained in Chicago, then in Savannah, and eventually in a small archive whose curator understood that documents need guardians. Families continued to use them quietly. A grandson in Alabama located cousins in Tennessee. A widow in Macon discovered that her brother had not died in 1859, but had been sold through an intermediary whose name still appears in faded ink. The 3 unaccounted names persist at the end of every transcription. Emma Brooks, and 2 children moved before dawn in December 1863. Sometimes I imagine Emma writing that final note, knowing the house might be searched, knowing walls do not protect forever. She did not attempt to overthrow the system. She did something more dangerous. She measured it. Power can endure accusation. It struggles against accounting. I have been asked whether exposing the ledger was worth the cost, the burned house, the threats, the years of caution that followed. I have no clean answer. The county did not transform overnight. The men involved were not marched in chains. History did not bend dramatically toward justice. But 30 people once declared non-existent were located. Names once denied registry were spoken aloud again. That is not revolution. It is restoration. What remains unsettled is not Maple Ridge itself, but the pattern it revealed. A system so confident in its control of paper that it believed absence could equal innocence. A culture where silence passed for order and order passed for virtue. If you have listened this far, I leave you with the same question that has shadowed me since 1866. How many other ledgers were hidden, then burned? How many walls were sealed not to preserve secrets, but to preserve power? Share your thoughts, your theories, or your own family traces of disappearance. And if you wish to continue examining the places where history was edited rather than written, subscribe and remain with me. Because the counting is never finished. It only pauses when no one is willing to continue.